There is a paradox so common that most never notice it. Someone will speak about consciousness, divinity, and creative power while simultaneously making every decision from a place of fear. They will read teachings about being the source of reality, yet freeze when circumstances challenge that belief. They will affirm their divine nature, then act as though external forces control their fate. This contradiction is not hypocrisy, it is the gap between knowing and embodying. In the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this gap is addressed directly and compassionately. The truth is clear, every human carries the creative power of consciousness itself. Yet fear, when believed, turns that God into a slave. How does this happen? Fear operates as a master only when consciousness forgets its true identity. The moment someone identifies with their circumstances instead of their creative power, fear gains authority. It whispers that the world is dangerous, that resources are limited, that others hold power over them, that failure is permanent. And when those whispers are believed, when they are accepted as truth rather than recognized as assumptions, they become the operating system of life. Every decision, every action, every thought flows from that fearful foundation. The person who is divine in essence begins to live as though they are fragile, powerless, and at the mercy of forces beyond their control. This is the slavery the title speaks of. Not literal chains, but the invisible bondage of accepted limitation. Consider how much energy is spent avoiding what might go wrong. Someone wants to pursue a dream but fears rejection, so they stay silent. Someone desires a relationship but fears abandonment, so they close off. Someone imagines abundance but fears loss, so they hoard and worry. In every case, fear dictates behavior. Yet fear itself has no creative power. It cannot manifest anything. Only consciousness creates. So what actually happens when someone acts from fear? They assume the state of the fearful outcome, dwell in that assumption through constant worry and defensive behavior, and consciousness, being perfectly obedient, manifests circumstances that match that state. The feared thing appears not because fear created it, but because consciousness created what was assumed. Fear was just the lens through which assumption operated. This is where the teachings become liberating rather than condemning. No one is broken for feeling fear. No one is failing for experiencing doubt. These are natural responses to the conditioning every human receives from birth. Society trains people to fear punishment, fear judgment, fear scarcity, fear loss. Religions often reinforce this by teaching that humans are sinful, small, and separate from the divine. So when someone finally encounters the truth that they are consciousness itself, that they are creative power in human form, the mind resists. It feels too big, too dangerous, too much responsibility. What if they claim that power and fail? What if they try and nothing changes? The fear of recognizing divinity becomes stronger than the suffering of living as a slave. But what if the only failure is refusing to try? The question here is not whether fear exists. The question is, who is in charge? Is consciousness directing fear, or is fear directing consciousness? When someone wakes in the morning feeling anxious about the day ahead, are they consciously choosing that state, or are they reacting habitually to old patterns? When someone encounters an obstacle, do they assume the state of the solution, or do they collapse into the state of the problem? The difference between living as God in human form and living as a slave to fear is simply this: the direction of attention and the choice of assumption. Fear will always present itself. Challenges will always arise. But the one who knows themselves as creative consciousness does not let fear choose their state. They feel the fear, acknowledge it, and then consciously assume the state of the desired outcome anyway. That is mastery. That is freedom. That is the end of slavery. Is that choice being made right now? The mechanism by which fear enslaves is simple. It hijacks the imagination. Imagination is the creative faculty through which consciousness manifests reality. What is vividly imagined with feeling becomes the blueprint for experience. Neville Goddard taught this as the core of manifestation. Imagination creates reality when combined with the assumption that what is imagined is already true. But most people use imagination unconsciously, and fear becomes the default director. They imagine worst-case scenarios, rehearse conversations where they are rejected, visualize outcomes where they fail. And because consciousness does not judge the content of imagination, it simply creates what is assumed. Those fearful images become lived experience. The very thing feared materializes not because fear has power, but because imagination was surrendered to it. There is a powerful analogy in the way seeds grow. A farmer plants a seed in soil, and the soil does not ask whether the seed will produce food or weeds. It simply provides the conditions for growth. Whatever is planted will grow. Consciousness operates the same way. It is the fertile ground in which assumptions take root. When someone plants seeds of fear, I will be rejected, I cannot succeed, I am not enough, consciousness grows those assumptions into experiences. When someone plants seeds of faith, I am loved, I am capable, I am divine creative power, consciousness grows those instead. The soil does not discriminate. The harvest reflects only what was planted. So the question becomes, what seeds are being planted daily through thought, feeling, and imagination? Most people live as though they are passengers in their own lives, reacting to whatever appears. They wake up and immediately check what the world is doing, news, messages, circumstances, and let that determine their state. If the news is bad, they feel anxious. If someone is upset with them, they feel guilty. If money is tight, they feel scared. This is the slavery of reaction. The external world becomes the master, and consciousness becomes the servant. But this is backward. Consciousness is meant to be the master, and the external world is meant to be the servant. The awakened individual reverses this. They wake and choose their state before engaging with the world. They assume the feeling of the wish fulfilled before checking circumstances. They direct their imagination toward the desired outcome regardless of present conditions. This is sovereignty. This is living as God rather than as slave. Greg Braden's research into the quantum field reveals something profound. The field responds to the heart's electromagnetic signal, which is generated by emotion and belief. The heart sends signals thousands of times stronger than the brain, and those signals interact with the quantum field that underlies all physical reality. When someone lives in fear, their heart broadcasts a frequency of contraction, lack, and danger. The field responds by collapsing possibilities that match that frequency. When someone lives in love, gratitude, and faith, their heart broadcasts expansion, abundance, and safety. The field responds accordingly. This is not metaphysical speculation, it is measurable science. Consciousness, expressed through emotion and belief, literally shapes the quantum field from which reality emerges. So fear does not just feel bad. It actively creates a reality that matches its frequency. The contrast is stark. One person walks through life bracing for impact. They expect betrayal, so they guard their heart. They expect failure, so they play small. They expect scarcity, so they hoard and compete. Every action is defensive. Every choice is protective. And the life they create reflects that contraction, limited opportunities, shallow relationships, constant struggle. But another person walks through life expecting grace. They assume things work in their favor. They trust that resources flow. They believe people are allies, not threats. And their life reflects that expansion. Doors open easily, connections deepen naturally, abundance appears consistently. Same world. Same laws of consciousness. Different assumptions. Different lives. The slave lives in fear's prison. The sovereign lives in faith's freedom. Which life is being lived right now, and is it time for that to change? Fear creates a prison without walls. There are no physical chains, no locked doors, yet movement feels impossible. This is because fear operates at the level of identity, not circumstance. When someone believes they are small, vulnerable, and dependent on external conditions, their behavior conforms to that belief automatically. They do not need to be told to stay small. They enforce their own limitations. They reject opportunities before they appear. They dismiss possibilities before testing them. They assume failure so completely that success never gets a chance to emerge. This is the most effective form of slavery, the kind where the prisoner becomes their own guard, and the key to the cell has always been in their hand. There is a theater metaphor that reveals everything. Imagine consciousness as the playwright, director, and lead actor all at once. The stage is life. The script is assumption. Most people forget they wrote the script and believe they are merely actors following someone else's direction. When tragedy unfolds on stage, they blame the script, the other actors, the audience, even the theater itself. But they forget, They are the playwright. They can rewrite the script at any moment. They are the director. They can change the scene, the lighting, the tone. They are the lead actor. They can embody a completely different character. Fear convinces them they are powerless extras in someone else's production. Truth reveals they are the creative force behind the entire performance. Which role is being played right now? The majority of humanity is hypnotized by appearances. They see lack and believe in lack. They see conflict and believe in conflict. They see limitation and believe in limitation. This is living from the outside in, letting the external world dictate the internal state. But consciousness does not work from outside in. It works from inside out. What is assumed internally manifests externally, always. So the person who sees financial struggle and assumes, "I am broke," is not observing reality. They are creating more of it. The person who sees illness and assumes, "I am sick," is not accepting truth. They are commanding consciousness to continue producing that experience. Appearances are not causes. They are effects. And effects cannot change until the cause, the assumption in consciousness, changes first. This is where the concept of living in the end becomes revolutionary. Most people try to change their circumstances through action alone. They work harder, try different strategies, force solutions. But if the underlying assumption remains fearful, all that effort produces minimal results. It is like redecorating a prison cell and calling it freedom. The walls are still there. True transformation happens when someone assumes the end state, the wish fulfilled, and lives from that assumption before any evidence appears. They feel wealthy before money arrives. They feel loved before the relationship manifests. They feel healthy before symptoms disappear. This is not pretending. This is commanding consciousness to create from a new blueprint. And consciousness, being infinitely obedient, has no choice but to comply. How long has someone been fighting effects instead of changing the cause? Fear tells a very specific lie. It says the external world is more real than internal states. It says circumstances are solid and unchangeable. It says other people have power over your experience. It says the past determines the future. But in the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, every single one of these statements is revealed as false. Consciousness is the only reality. Circumstances are fluid reflections of internal states. No one has power over another's consciousness unless that power is assumed and accepted. The past has no authority except the authority given to it through repeated attention and belief. When these lies are seen clearly, fear loses its grip. The slave realizes the chains were always imaginary. The prison was always unlocked. And freedom was always just one assumption away. Is that assumption being made now, or is fear still believed? There is a verse in 2 Timothy, chapter 1, verse 7, that cuts through centuries of religious conditioning with surgical precision. The words declare, "For God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind." Most read this as encouragement, a gentle reminder to be brave. But when examined through the lens of the lessons learned from reading the works of Neville Goddard, this verse becomes a direct revelation about the nature of consciousness and identity. It is not a gift being offered from an external God. It is a statement of what already exists within every human being. The spirit, the consciousness, the I am, was never designed to operate from fear. Fear is not the true nature. Power, love, and clarity are the foundation. Fear is the costume. Divinity is the reality. Break down the phrase, "God has not given us a spirit of fear." This is not about a distant deity withholding fear from helpless humans. It is about the creative consciousness that sources all existence, the consciousness within every individual, never producing fear as its natural state. Fear is not inherent to consciousness. It is learned, adopted, and assumed through conditioning. A child is not born afraid of failure, rejection, or lack. Those fears are taught, repeated, and eventually believed so deeply they feel like truth. But they were never the original programming. They are viruses installed by external influence. The verse confirms this. The core essence, the God consciousness within, is fear-free. Fear is the addition, not the foundation. The second phrase, "but of power and of love and of a sound mind," reveals what consciousness actually is when uncorrupted by false belief. Power here is not dominance or control. It is creative capacity, the ability to assume and manifest, the authority to direct reality through imagination and feeling. Love is not sentimentality. It is the harmonic frequency of unity, the recognition that consciousness is one expressing as many, the state where separation dissolves and creation flows effortlessly. A sound mind is not intellectual brilliance. It is clarity, coherence, the absence of contradictory beliefs that create internal conflict. These three, power, love, and soundness, are the natural state of awakened consciousness. When someone operates from this state, fear has no ground to stand on. How many people have lived their entire lives believing fear was protecting them? How many have made every major decision from a place of, what if it goes wrong, rather than, what if it goes right? This verse validates the exhaustion of that way of living. It says clearly, fear is not your nature. You were not created to shrink, to hide, to play small, to protect yourself from a hostile universe. That is the slave mentality. The divine nature is expansive, creative, loving, and clear. When someone finally accepts this, not as philosophy but as operational truth, their entire approach to life transforms. They stop defending and start creating. They stop reacting and start directing. They stop surviving and start thriving. The shift is not gradual. It is immediate, the moment the true identity is assumed. This is the practical application of the verse. Every time fear arises, it can now be recognized as a signal that consciousness has temporarily forgotten its true nature. Fear is not a truth to obey. It is a lie to dismiss. When fear says, "You cannot," consciousness responds, "I am, and therefore I can." When fear says, "You are not enough," consciousness responds, "I am the source of all sufficiency." When fear says, "The world is against you," consciousness responds, "The world is my reflection, and I choose what it reflects." The verse is not asking for faith in an external power. It is reminding every individual of the power they already are. The God in human form does not bow to fear. The God in human form recognizes fear as the imposter and assumption as the throne. Which one is being honored right now, and is it time to reclaim sovereignty? When consciousness stops acting from fear and starts operating from its true nature, reality does not gradually improve, it restructures completely. The person who once hesitated begins to move with certainty. The person who once asked permission begins to grant it to themselves. The person who once waited for conditions to be perfect begins to create from whatever is present. This is not personality change or positive thinking. This is identity shift. The slave identity, built on fear and limitation, collapses. The divine identity, rooted in power and creative authority, takes its rightful place. And because consciousness creates reality, every external circumstance rearranges to reflect the new internal state. Relationships that were strained either heal or fall away naturally. Opportunities that were blocked suddenly open. Resources that seemed scarce begin to flow. What changes first is not the world, it is the assumption about the world. Responsibility becomes thrilling instead of terrifying when understood correctly. For years, someone might have blamed their suffering on bad luck, other people, past trauma, or systemic forces. And while external conditions certainly exist, they only have power when consciousness assumes they do. The moment someone recognizes that every experience begins as an assumption, blame dissolves. Not because suffering was their fault, but because creation is their power. Consider the person who spent years fearing abandonment. Every relationship reflected that fear, partners left, friendships faded, connections felt fragile. But the moment they assumed the state of being deeply valued and irreplaceable, their relationships transformed. Not because people changed, but because the person stopped broadcasting the frequency of fear and started broadcasting the frequency of worthiness. The world simply matched the new signal. There are countless silent examples of this principle operating unnoticed. The entrepreneur who feared failure for years, then suddenly assumed inevitable success and watched their business explode. The artist who feared criticism, then assumed their work was valuable regardless of opinion, and found their audience immediately. The person diagnosed with a serious illness who refused to assume the identity of sick person, and instead lived from the state of wholeness, then watched their body reflect that assumption through unexpected healing. These are not anomalies or miracles. These are demonstrations of the law Neville Goddard taught with absolute clarity. Consciousness assumed and felt as true becomes fact. Fear was creating experiences. Divine assumption replaced it. Reality followed. What has fear been creating, and what would divine assumption create instead? The teaching becomes radical when applied to situations that feel irreversible. What about the career that ended badly? What about the reputation that was damaged? What about the person who died, the opportunity that passed, the door that closed permanently? From the fear-based perspective, these are tragedies to mourn and accept. But from the consciousness that knows itself as creative power, nothing is irreversible until it is assumed as irreversible. Circumstances are not solid objects. They are energetic formations held in place by repeated assumption. When the assumption changes, the formation dissolves and reforms. Neville taught this through his principle of revision. Changing the past in imagination changes its effect on the present. This sounds impossible only to the mind that believes time is linear and the past is fixed. But consciousness operates outside time. What is revised internally with conviction must externalize as changed circumstance. The preparation for living as God instead of as slave requires only one practice: the willingness to catch fear in the act and replace it with assumption. When fear whispers, "This will fail," pause. Feel the fear without obeying it. Then consciously assume the opposite: "This succeeds effortlessly." When fear says, "They will reject you," acknowledge the feeling, then assume, "I am received with love." When fear says, "There is not enough," notice it, then assume, "Abundance is my natural state." This is not affirmation for the sake of feeling better. This is conscious direction of the creative power. Each time fear is recognized and replaced with divine assumption, the old pattern weakens. Each time the desired state is assumed despite present conditions, consciousness is trained to create from sovereignty rather than slavery. The question is not whether fear will arise. It will. The question is, who decides what gets assumed? Fear or the God within? That decision is happening right now. The existential impact of recognizing oneself as God in human form while simultaneously acting as a slave to fear creates a fracture in the soul. It is the dissonance of knowing truth and living lies. It is the agony of sensing infinite potential while choosing finite limitation. Every person who has encountered these teachings and felt them resonate deeply has also felt this fracture. The mind agrees, "Yes, I am consciousness, I am creative power." But the body still tenses at conflict. The emotions still collapse at rejection. The behavior still contracts at uncertainty. This gap between knowing and being is where most spiritual seekers live indefinitely, aware of the truth, yet unable to embody it fully. But this gap is not permanent. It is simply the space where transformation occurs. The fracture is not failure. It is the breaking open that allows the new identity to emerge. There is a powerful image that captures this perfectly: a tree growing through concrete. The seed falls into a crack in the pavement, and against all logic, it grows. The concrete is hard, fixed, seemingly immovable. But the life force within the seed is relentless. It does not argue with the concrete. It does not wait for the concrete to soften. It simply grows, and the concrete splits. Eventually, the tree stands tall, roots deep, branches wide, and the concrete that once seemed so solid is broken into pieces around it. This is what happens when divine identity pushes through fear-based conditioning. The conditioning feels immovable. The patterns feel permanent. But the life force of true consciousness is stronger. It does not need the fear to dissolve first. It simply assumes its nature and grows. Fear cracks. Truth emerges. The slave identity breaks apart, and the God within stands fully revealed. The connection between body, mind, and spirit becomes undeniable when living from divine assumption. The body, which once felt heavy and reactive, begins to respond differently. Tension releases. Energy increases. Illness that was chronic begins to shift. Why? Because the body is not separate from consciousness. It is consciousness made visible. Tom Campbell's research into consciousness as the fundamental reality confirms this. The physical body is a data stream within a larger consciousness system. When the consciousness assumes a fearful, limited identity, the body reflects that through stress, disease, and deterioration. When consciousness assumes its divine nature, powerful, whole, creative, the body reflects that through vitality, healing, and regeneration. The mind, no longer split between fear and desire, becomes clear and focused. Decisions become obvious. Action becomes effortless. And the spirit, the core essence, finally aligns with its true nature. This alignment is not mystical. It is mechanical. Change the assumption, change the system. There is a call happening in this moment that is louder than fear, deeper than doubt, and older than any conditioning. It is the call from consciousness itself to stop pretending to be small. It is the invitation to drop the act of powerlessness and step fully into creative authority. This call does not demand perfection. It does not require years of spiritual practice or mastery of complex techniques. It requires only one thing: the willingness to assume the identity of God in human form and act from that assumption consistently. Not sometimes. Not when it feels safe. Not when evidence appears. Consistently. In every moment. In every challenge. In every choice. The person who answers this call does not become arrogant or detached. They become grounded, compassionate, and unstoppable. Because they are no longer fighting fear, they are creating from a place where fear has no authority. The transition from intellectual understanding to lived embodiment happens through practice, but not the kind of practice that feels like discipline or effort. It is the practice of catching oneself mid-fear and choosing assumption instead. It is the practice of noticing when the slave identity is speaking and letting the divine identity respond. It is the practice of imagining the desired outcome with such conviction that present circumstances fade into irrelevance. This practice does not require hours. It requires moments, consistent, conscious, deliberate moments where the choice is made. Will fear direct this experience, or will I? Every time the answer is, I will, sovereignty strengthens. Every time divine assumption replaces fearful reaction, the old identity weakens. And eventually, the practice becomes automatic. The divine identity is no longer something claimed occasionally, it is the default. The slave is no longer the familiar state, it is the distant memory. And life becomes the full expression of what consciousness always was: God in human form, creating freely, loving deeply, and living without the chains fear once imposed. Is that transition ready to begin? There is a practice that transforms the relationship with fear permanently, and it can be done at any moment, in any circumstance, without preparation or special conditions. The practice is this: the next time fear arises, whether it is fear of failure, rejection, loss, or inadequacy, pause completely. Do not react. Do not obey. Do not let the fear dictate the next thought, word, or action. Instead, name it silently. This is fear. This is not truth. This is not my nature. Then, immediately and deliberately, assume the opposite state. If fear says, I will lose everything, assume, I am supported infinitely. If fear says, I am not enough, assume, I am complete and whole. Speak it internally as a declaration, not as hope. Feel it as already true, not as wishful thinking. Hold that assumption for just 10 conscious breaths, feeling it saturate the body, the mind, the heart. Then move forward from that state, allowing action to flow from divine assumption rather than fearful reaction. This practice does not eliminate fear from appearing. It eliminates fear from ruling. It trains consciousness to recognize fear as a visitor, not the owner of the house. Each time this practice is done, each time fear is acknowledged and then replaced with sovereign assumption, the neural pathways of reaction weaken and the pathways of conscious creation strengthen. Over time, fear loses its automatic authority. It still knocks, but it no longer controls the door. The person who practices this consistently becomes someone who feels fear and creates anyway, who acknowledges doubt and assumes divinity anyway, who encounters obstacles and imagines solutions anyway. This is mastery. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear choose the state of consciousness. And because consciousness creates reality, this refusal changes everything. For those who feel the resonance of this teaching and want to continue receiving guidance that supports living as God in human form rather than as slave to fear, subscribing to this channel and activating notifications ensures these messages reach them consistently. This is not about content consumption. It is about staying connected to a frequency that reinforces truth when the world tries to reinforce fear. Every person who engages here, who shares their breakthroughs in the comments, who passes this teaching to someone else struggling under fear's weight, is participating in a collective awakening. One person's freedom inspires another's courage. One person's assumption of divinity gives permission for another to do the same. This is how slavery ends, not through fighting fear, but through choosing sovereignty so completely that fear has nowhere left to stand. Now the ultimate question presents itself, and it cannot be avoided or postponed. If the truth is that every human being is God in human form, consciousness with creative authority, power unlimited by anything except assumption, then why continue acting as a slave to fear? What is gained by living small when greatness is the actual nature? What is protected by staying fearful when divine assumption is available in every moment? The answer, often, is nothing. Fear protects nothing. It creates only more of what is feared. The slave identity preserves nothing. It only prevents the fullness of life from being experienced. So the question becomes sharper. What would happen if, starting now, divine assumption replaced every fearful thought? What would manifest if sovereignty became the default instead of the exception? What life would emerge if the God within finally stopped pretending to be powerless? The teaching is complete, but the transformation is just beginning. Because consciousness, once it recognizes itself as the creative force behind all experience, cannot return to unconscious slavery. It can only grow deeper into its own nature. Every fear faced and replaced with assumption strengthens the divine identity. Every circumstance transformed through conscious creation proves the principle again. Every moment lived from sovereignty instead of fear becomes evidence that the title was never exaggeration, it was truth. The human being is God in form. The slave costume was always optional. Fear was always just an assumption that could be dropped the moment a different assumption was chosen. And now that this is known, truly known, the only question left is this. Will the next moment be created by fear, or by the God who has always been present, waiting to be recognized, honored, and allowed to create freely? The chains are unlocked. The prison is open. The slave can walk out and become the sovereign. And everything changes from there.